No particular order. I'm going to introduce them. We've got Jonathan Fortman. Jonathan's an attorney. He's an owner of the law offices of Jonathan E. Fortman, LLC, located in St. Louis, Missouri. He's devoted his practice to fighting for individuals injured by conduct of others since he began practicing. The law office has now begun limiting practice to class actions and franchise issues on behalf of franchisees. Second from that end, we've got Keith Miller. He's a principal at Franchisee Advocacy Consulting. Keith and his wife have been Subway franchisees for 28 years in Auburn and Grass Valley, California. Keith helped form the North American Association of Subway Franchisees and has served as the association's first chairman. But more importantly, he's been instrumental in passing and promoting franchise laws across the country. Paul Wakeman was supposed to be here, and unfortunately, he's a Bright Star Care franchise. And unfortunately, he couldn't be here. He had a family emergency. But fortunately, our next speaker's topic mostly overlapped with his. And we're incredibly fortunate to have him here. He's sitting right here to my left. He brings an incredible amount of experience and knowledge. Craig Tregillus from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission recently retired, but he's been there since the beginning, and when franchise regulations were merely an idea. And he might still be there if they hadn't shut down the government last year. But he brings a wealth of valuable knowledge that I'm sure is going to benefit us all. And last but not least, we've got our fearless leader over here, Bob Turbin, and he's the chairman of the board of trustees of AAFD. He's the author of Franchise Fraud: How to Protect Yourselves Before and After You Invest. He has practiced franchise law since 1973, and he's a certified specialist in franchise and distribution law by the State Bar of California. Over the course of his career, Bob's gained a reputation as a preeminent authority on representing franchisees, and he also engages in contract and dispute mediation and is an approved mediator of the National Franchise Mediation Program and the CPR Institute of Dispute Resolution. And with that, I'm going to put you in this panel's capable hands.
This part hasn't been rehearsed, so
Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here.
something happened.
Oh, something did happen.
You have to roll. Yes. Usually we have no problem.
So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that for 5 years before I joined the Federal Trade Commission, I worked for a franchise law firm where we mostly represented franchisors, but also a few franchisees. Oops, yeah. I want to, that didn't work. There's no clicker.
Oh, no, just
Enter key?
every time you either up or
Oh, okay. You use the up key?
you use up or down, whichever way you want to. Just look down.
No?
The space bar.
No, none of them are working.
You said this. Here, let me see.
Is there a 13-year-old in here?
There we go. So I need to start out, even though I'm a former employee, by making it clear that my views do not necessarily represent the views of my former employer, the Federal Trade Commission, or any individual commissioner, as I'm sure you'll gather as we go further. part of my job was to listen to franchisee complaints, and I heard everything that you can imagine, I'm sure. Typically, I got a desperate call from somebody in dire straits, and I wanted to give you a sample of the kinds of things I heard from those franchisees. Each of what I'm about to tell you I heard more than once. First, my franchisor lied to me about how much money I could make, and I maxed out my credit cards paying my royalties, and then I simply couldn't do it anymore, and the franchisor wrongfully terminated me and locked me out of my store, and I didn't know what to do, but then I got the call from my bank that said it was foreclosing on my house, which was collateral for my franchise loan. And when that happened, my wife said she was going to divorce me, even though she fully supported the franchise purchase, or at least I thought she had. And to top it all off, I just got out of the hospital because I had a major heart attack. I've been under so much stress. I heard all of those things. And that, I'm afraid, is part of what informs the concerns that I'm going to be expressing today. Our topic, as you know, is there equity in franchising? I want to talk about three aspects of that: the legal challenges facing franchisees, franchisee ownership or sweat equity under the law, and what everyone can do to protect their equity. Now, equity in the law, equity generally has at least a few meanings. One has to do with equity in the law, and equity really comes from Latin and Greek words, Latin and French words meaning equal. And equity in the law formed initially in church courts, primarily Catholic church courts in the Middle Ages. And the notion of equality informed those courts in this sense. Everyone in the court, lay or clergy, was regarded as equal in the eyes of God, and that's where equality comes into it. Now, the church courts would always ask, given that, what is the morally fair and equitable resolution of this dispute between two equal children under God? Civil courts have taken over equity from the church courts, but equity in general has relatively little to do with commercial law of contracts that govern our commercial relationships, and I'm afraid from my point of view, nowhere is that better illustrated than in franchising. Now, with regard to ownership equity, which is what everyone here I'm sure cares about, ownership equity is also based on the notion of equals, an equal willing buyer and an equal willing seller who are equals because they both have the same information. There's no disparity in information, as there used to be, at least in franchising before disclosure regimens took place. But really the equity is the part of the sale price that reflects the annual earnings and some multiple of the annual earnings as agreed to by that willing buyer and seller. Now, my concern is that increasingly over the years that I've been involved with franchising, the law seems to me to have become more and more stacked against franchisees. Franchise contracts now give, we still didn't change, give franchisors nearly absolute power, and I'm afraid we know what that can mean because absolute power at least can corrupt absolutely. Franchisors, as you may know, have been refining their contracts for the last more than 50 years, and it should come as no surprise to anyone here that these refinements over the years have increased the contractual rights and powers of franchisors and reduced those of franchisees. I'll give you a quick example of that, of how they've become lopsided in the franchisor's favor from my point of view. Back when I started in franchising, most franchise contracts said that they were going to settle disputes between franchisor and franchisee in the local courts of the franchisor's state, even though the franchisee might have been several states distant from that, and that the law will be applied from the franchisor's home state. Several states thought that was unfair, and at least some states passed laws saying that those choice of law provisions, as they were called, were illegal in those states. And increasingly, franchisees at about the same time began bringing class action suits against their franchisors over areas of dispute. So strangely enough, franchisors decided to take advantage of something called the Federal Arbitration Act, and they immediately inserted in their contracts provisions requiring arbitration that forecloses you from litigation, so that they effectively barred litigation. But then clever franchisees and their lawyers decided, well, if we have to bring arbitration cases, why should we bring them one at a time? Why shouldn't we do group arbitrations or class arbitrations? And strangely enough, most of the modern franchise contracts I've seen prohibit even that. So that's what I mean about the changes that have occurred over the past 50 years. My real concern here, fundamentally, is that there, from my point of view, are no effective checks or balances against a franchisor's contractual rights in the law today. And the reason that's important is, before I get there, I want to say, I have to tell you that I met many franchisors in my days in private practices who were very good people and who understood that their success really depended on your success, the franchisee's success. But I have some concerns that over the years, as the original group of founders of franchises have passed away and sold their franchises, that we're in a different situation now with corporations that have either acquired a number of franchises and gone into debt to do it, or leveraged buyouts of franchisors that have created piles of debt for the franchisor, and the result has been a squeeze on franchisee profitability. Now, the reason this is all important, actually, it's not necessarily the case that all franchisors are still good people. Your franchise rights are determined only by your franchise contracts, and of course will usually, and from my point of view in most cases mercilessly, enforce their terms. To get a franchise, of course, you have to sign and agree to the contract. Now, what the courts conveniently ignore when they base their opinion that the contract obliges you to do this is that you had to sign the contract if you wanted to get the franchise. In the old days, the courts used to look askance at such take-it-or-leave-it contracts, but not so much anymore, now that we all have cell phone contracts that we never read, and so on, especially because we don't have to read them because we have no choice, just as franchisees have no choice, typically, if you want the franchise, you have to sign the agreement. But now, one of the things you have to agree to in the franchise contract is that no false claims were made, especially no false earnings claims. And that's typically a provision of the contract. And so they say that no one who was affiliated with the franchisors helped sell you the franchise, told you how much you could make, other than maybe what's in the disclosure document if they make an earnings disclosure in the disclosure document. Now, I have to tell you that in my work, many franchisees, turns out, had signed that disclaimer, even sometimes initially in the contract, even though they knew it wasn't true because the salesman told them, if you don't sign this, you're not getting a franchise. So they were in a tough position. Now, a lot of franchise contracts give you what's called a right to renew. And it would be a right to renew if it were under the same terms as the contract you already had, but now they don't say it that way. It's under different terms. It's the then current terms offered to new franchisees, and those could be higher royalties, higher ad fund contributions, any number of things that are disadvantageous to franchisees when they go to renew their franchise. Now, another provision that's pretty typical in franchises is one that gives you a right to sell or transfer your franchise. But is it really a right if you have to get the franchisor's approval? Because that could, at least in theory, be a problem. Now, another way that the law is stacked against franchisees is that franchisors have figured out how to use the pre-sale disclosures that federal law and some state laws require you to receive, and they've figured out how to use those against you. The whole point of giving you this disclosure information was to transfer to the buyer the information that would make him equal with the seller in knowledge about what he was getting into. But I'm afraid it hasn't really worked that way effectively. So what franchisors are doing is they are persuading judges and arbitrators that you were fully informed of the risks of buying because you got all these disclosures. And that makes it pretty hard for franchisees to prevail on fraud or misrepresentation claims they might want to bring against their franchisor, such as lying about earnings claims. So, why is it that this works for the franchisor? Well, you had to sign a receipt that they kept a copy of when you received the disclosure document, and it shows the date that you received it. The receipt shows that you had at least 14 calendar days that are required by law to read the disclosure document. That's, I might say, often 1 to 3 to 4 to 5 inches thick, and to do your due diligence in investigating the franchise. So that helps to persuade a judge, of course, that you should have known, but you may very well not have known. Oh, wait a minute. No, I may not be able to go back. So the smart franchisors are throwing everything into the disclosure document that could possibly be used against them in any case that you might want to bring or that you might want to assert in your defense in the case they bring against you. So how can they, the franchisor can bankrupt you in any private dispute. How can they do that? Franchisors typically demand, as part of the application process, as you probably all know, an itemization of all your assets so that they know that you can afford the franchise, or at least that's what they say. But remember, they know every dollar you had when you went into the deal. And you had to then report all the earnings from the franchise in your weekly or monthly royalty reports, so they know how much money you've made since you started. True, they may not know exactly how much money you have, but they certainly know, in general terms, how much you can afford to spend in any private legal dispute before you go broke. So basically, they can keep litigating until you're bankrupt, because they can run up your legal bills with lengthy discovery requests and drag out the proceedings until you run out of money, if they're so inclined. Now, and to add insult to injury, guess who's paying the franchisor's legal bills? Your fellow franchisees' royalties are paying them. So your franchisor gets to use free money to sue you. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Where's the fundamental moral fairness in this predicament that's frankly not all that unusual for countless franchisees? You'd think that franchisees would be yelling, like actor Peter Finch's character in that old movie, Network, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore." But wait, there's more. What about your franchise equity? Well, suppose you bought an existing business, not a franchise, maybe a restaurant. Your seller's asking price would have included components that included the land at its appreciated value. It might have gone up in value in the years he was running the business. Buildings and fixtures, at least at their depreciated cost. Equipment and inventory, depreciated value of the equipment and the cost of the inventory that he's turning over to you. And then that element of goodwill, or the equity value of the business. Now, goodwill, as I indicated earlier, is usually a multiple of annual earnings, and that's where the seller's sweat equity profit is. Often it's 2 or 3 times the annual earnings, maybe whatever gets negotiated, but that's the starting point. So, instead, you bought a franchise. You've been a good franchisee for many years, and the franchisor has no complaints about you. But now you want or need to sell your franchise. Maybe you have a medical problem or a family problem, and you need to move on from being a franchisee. So what's your asking price? Those same components. Well, let's take a look at it. First, let's look at land. Oops. Franchisor may own the land or the lease to the land. As you probably know, there are franchisors like McDonald's that insist on ownership of the land and even the building, and they lease it to you during the term of your franchise. Well then, what about buildings and fixtures? Oops, the franchisor owns them for some of the same reasons. But even if what you've got is a leasehold in, say, a strip mall or something like that, often the franchisor will demand to be the one who negotiates the lease and leases in his name, and then he subleases to you. Or he insists that if you're the lessee, that there be a provision in your lease that if you violate either the franchise agreement or the lease agreement, he gets to move in and take over the lease. So maybe you don't have much of an asset to sell there. And what I forgot to mention that in the building and fixtures department, you may have paid for a drive-in window that you have to put in because your franchisor required to pay you for it. Well, that piece of the building is considered to go with the building and the land because it's an integral part of the building and can't be separated from it. So you just lost all that money because you can't get compensation for it, possibly. Well, what about goodwill equity? Well, there's a catch there too. It could be a problem, but isn't necessarily. The catch is that your franchise contract says your franchisor has the right to approve the sale. And ordinarily you'd think, well, that can't be too bad. But the franchisor doesn't have to approve the sale. And even when the contract says approval will not be withheld unreasonably. Well, how could that be? How could he not approve it if he's not allowed to approve to be unreasonable in disapproving it? Well, there's an answer in the law, unfortunately. Trademark law says that the trademark owner is the sole owner of the goodwill equity in the trademark. And you're just licensing the use of it. In fact, many franchise contracts begin by telling you that the franchisor owns the trademark and the equity in it. So if your sale price includes any goodwill money, your franchisor can reasonably withhold its approval. Never mind that you've worked 50, 60, 70 hours a week for years to develop a profitable outlet location that you own. So where's the fundamental moral fairness in that? Bottom line, though, is that this law says you don't get any money for the goodwill equity you create at your franchise location. In fact, though, it's even worse because there's no real financial incentive for your franchisor to approve a sale for you. Why is that? Well, if you don't get the franchise approval, you may have to abandon your franchise, just walk away from it because the deal may fall through with the buyer that you have, or you simply can't afford to keep going and paying royalties and leasehold costs or whatever. And I've seen cases where that's happened. The franchisor gets to resell your franchise and collect a full initial franchise fee from the buyer if that happens. You, of course, don't get anything. Now, it's more profitable for the franchisor to do that than collect a transfer fee that's typically a great deal less. Now, I understand that many franchisors will, in fact, out of the kindness of their hearts, allow franchisees to sell their franchises and receive some compensation for goodwill, even though their contracts say that they own all the goodwill in their marks. But if a franchisor were to think that the goodwill amount you've negotiated is so high that it may jeopardize the buyer's financial ability to operate the franchise successfully, they might still disapprove the sale. And that's a chilling effect on your ability to negotiate the best deal for you. Bottom line is, there's nothing in the law that would prevent a franchisor from disapproving any franchise sale that includes compensation for goodwill, which is your sweat equity. Now, as you you probably know, many franchisors promise to set you up in, quote, your own business, so you can, quote, be your own boss. But surprise, you don't really own or control your business, you don't have a business that you alone own or control. So what does a franchisee buy? Well, in fact, when you think about it, it's not much difference in buying a franchise from buying a job. And the fact is that there are some franchises, like janitorial franchises, where you are buying a job with a projected monthly income amount, and you have different levels depending on how much you're willing to spend at the outset that you are supposed to get in business that you can do in cleaning commercial buildings. But you do get some things that you otherwise wouldn't get. At least in theory, you get guidance, assistance, reduced risk of failure, a marketing plan, and the benefit of the franchisor's experience. What I have seen most often, of course, is that with many startup franchises, the guidance and assistance may be quite limited, and the risk of failure pretty high because the trademark doesn't yet have an established market and doesn't deliver customers to the doorstep of the franchisee. But franchisees, in all cases, do get something that I never in my life received, which is valuable business tax breaks, which can often be very important. So the best case, if you're a franchisee, is you make a good living, you can afford a comfortable lifestyle, you can save enough for the retirement you want, you have enough left over to pass on to your children, and the fact is there are franchises where that's possible, where it really is a win-win, and franchisors understand that their success depends on their franchisee's success. But the worst case is that you earn less or barely exceed the poverty level. Now, oddly enough, $30,170 for a family of 5. And there are franchises, I'm sorry to say, where that's possible, or where people make less, or only a little more, such as the janitorial franchises and some convenience store franchises. And I suspect that's where people have compared franchisees to indentured servants and sometimes even slaves. Now, how can you protect your equity? As you've seen, the law largely favors franchisors and could deprive franchisees of their equity, if not for the leniency of many franchisors. They get to expand their brand using your money, which doesn't cost them interest, and will profit from the resale of your franchise, even if it fails. If bad things happen to even one franchisee, they can happen to any other franchisee in that franchise. I come back to this because so many unexpected things can go wrong for franchisees in a franchise. For example, suddenly a new quality control inspector gets installed in your district, and that quality control expert finds everything wrong with your franchise every time he comes, and you get a really bad reputation with the franchisor because of his reports, even though you had been flying high and getting great reports for many years before he arrived. Or new managers and executives of the franchisor take over, and they impose new requirements that really jeopardize your ability to continue to make your living. You get the picture. So the final thing is, oops, I shot over it, that you will likely be bankrupt in any fight you try to take on your own with your franchisor. So in short, I really see very little equity in franchising. So how can you protect your equity? As you've seen, oh, by the way, yes, if this doesn't make you mad to sell and ready to do something to protect your equity, nothing will. As you've seen, going it alone is only a recipe for failure, bankruptcy, and even worse, personal disasters like I described at the outset. So, what's the alternative? My answer is making friends and allies. Franchisees ultimately outnumber franchisors, as I'm sure you realize, but our only hope of success and influence is by organizing. Franchisees can organize to negotiate solutions to issues with their franchisors. And from my point of view, even more importantly, to educate the public about their view of the difficulties of being a franchisee. Now, the public generally, I think, views franchises as the equivalent of an ATM, where all franchisees make a bucket of money. And that's certainly the image projected by a popular reality TV show that's aired recently that you may have seen called Undercover Boss, which mostly seems to involve an undercover franchisor going to visit the premises of franchisees. So the public has a very positive image of franchising where nothing is wrong, and I think there needs to be a re-education campaign, and I might add that I think that the constantly turning over commissioners at the Federal Trade Commission are among that group. Finally, the organization hope you advocate for franchise laws that are more fair and equitable at the state and federal level. Now, why create? I'm suggesting here that franchisees need to organize not just their own franchises, but all franchises in your community. Obviously, if you have your own franchisee organization for your franchise, it can work with AAFD to negotiate win-win solutions to issues with your franchisor. Often it's a matter of educating a franchisor who doesn't really know much about franchise law, but had a great business idea, about how to be successful in franchising themselves. And that can lead to the win-win solutions. Now, if you don't have a network of all the different franchise owners in your hometown, if you organize one for mutual support, public education, and advocacy, that will help in the larger task of trying to bring some equity to the laws that govern franchising, which you're going to need to galvanize other franchisees, not just your own. Now, you may not have heard of the black entrepreneur who, during the days of Marion Barry, who was mayor of D.C., as some of you may know, for many, many years, a call came out for people to bid on the cable contract for Washington, D.C., and a lot of major companies, the local power utility, the local telephone utility, all put in bids. And so did this very small unknown company with almost no assets called DC Cablevision Inc. And it was owned by a man named Robert L. Johnson, who nobody had ever heard of either. He won the cable contract. And as he explained, after he won it, you've got to make your friends before you need them. And that is part of my message to you, that it's important to start making friends and contacts now to advance the cause of franchise equity. If you don't have friends in your local media, print, radio, TV, you need to start making them. Same is true for your local, your state and federal representatives. And as I hope you know, the International Franchise Association, that represents primarily franchisors, but now also claims to represent some franchisees as well, they are very active in imposing almost any measure at the state or federal level that might bring a little bit of equity to franchising, as Keith will, I'm sure, tell you. But in addition to that, your employees are beginning to organize, either by virtue of the joint employer doctrine, but for sure in the for 15, you've seen, I'm sure, the stories about fast food restaurant employees organizing for that. So my message to you is that I think you need to organize and tell your story. And that's my hope for this group and our work during this conference.